I wanted to take a minute to talk, just to give you more of an example of what I'm talking about when I say that we can put into practice, not necessarily, your change doesn't necessarily have to be the big change. I mean, that's a goal, but there are small things that you can do, and we're focusing on description. So I'm going to show you something that I did in one of the collections in university archives. So I'm going to show you the Frank P. Bisag papers, which is essentially a collection of the interviews that he conducted in the course of writing a book. And the book was called Anatomy of a Riot, Buffalo, 1967. And I'll show you down here that originally the description for the entire collection was what this overview is. It tells you what's in there and just gives you a super basic background. There's the biographical note about him personally. This is a pretty momentous thing that happened in Buffalo, and not only that, but it was part of something that was happening across the country at the time. And so what I did was take the description and expand it to give users not just more information about this collection, but the way it is situated within a larger context. So I begin by setting up this particular series of protests and events in Buffalo within the larger context in the country. It's become known as the Long Hot Summer of 1967. There was a number of protests, rebellions, uprisings that were happening across the country, and that specific language is something I wanted to address. So the book that he wrote is called Anatomy of a Riot, but riot has certain connotations, and the word riot has been used to devalue and delegitimize protests and other events, specifically that come out of the Black community protesting racism. We still hear that now. So I wanted to give not only the background, but to update the language. I'm not going to change the title of the book. That's what it's called, Anatomy of a Riot. But, just because language existed then doesn't mean that that's what we need to use now. So again, in this description, I'm discussing sort of where those events were coming out of across the country, and then situating it here. I'm going to try to highlight this so you can see it. That talks about where this originated in Buffalo and why. So I am not from Buffalo, and I'm white, and I'm fairly young. I wasn't alive during these events. So this took a lot of research on my part, and I have to say that, I had to really think about, am I the best person to write this? This is my job. But I took the opportunity to use a number of resources and do research and see what other people had written about the events. And so, to write this fairly short paragraph, and to even just a number of these paragraphs, I had to do a lot of research about what was going on, not just across the country, but in Buffalo. Some of you are in Buffalo, a lot of you are not, and the east side of Buffalo is primarily now a Black neighborhood, and it started out as a lot of parts of different cities across the country have started out, maybe, I'm not an expert, with waves of immigration. And in here I'm just talking about how that kind of change in population is something that's set up, the ways that the dynamics of the neighborhood in terms of like people who had lived there, people who are living there now, people who feel like the neighborhood belongs to them, and those kinds of feelings that all kind of lead up to this. Again, I'm also not like a sociologist, so is where I'm drawing on other resources. So there's the background of what's going on in the country. Here's the background of what's going on in what we call the Rust Belt, in this sort of area of the country where, massive deindustrialization left a lot of people unemployed. where specifically, you know, when we talk about the wave of immigration through this neighborhood, you know, some groups of people come through and they start out, you know, as poor immigrants. Maybe they can't read, they don't speak English, but they're also white. They have opportunities through education to change things. And that's a lot of opportunities that were not available to Black people then. You can argue also that that's not available now to everybody. And here I'm also going to talk about the West Side, which is actually where this originated. It's also a neighborhood I live in, so this was interesting to me specifically. And then moving on to sort of a couple of the outcomes of this, again, just sort of situate this on a timeline. What happened after all of these events, not just in Buffalo. And then moving on to the context of the book. In it, the author states that the purpose of the study was to create an objective statement, but that he notes that as he moved through, you know, he felt that the kind of information he was collecting wasn't what he, you know, quote unquote factual reporting, which I think is what we were talking about in archives too. You know, there are facts, which maybe, you know, you can or can't deny, but the context is everything. And then also something to keep in mind is, you know, when I first looked at the documentation of this, it looked like, oh, the university said, oh, let's send one of our professors to document this. But it turns out, and this comes from the author himself, that it was the residents of the communities that prompted the study. People who had witnessed the events, they approached one of these centers that was like a joint effort throughout some institutions, academic and otherwise, in the city, to document this. So that really came from the community, which I thought was something that was important to note. And one other thing I'd like to point out is that this is a pretty small collection. It's one manuscript box. It's, you know, not quite half a linear foot. So, you know, it's like a few inches of folders. But in this case, it really warranted, you know, a couple of days of research and writing and checking on things, because it's an important event and it didn't have a lot of information to go with it. And, you know, all other things aside, personal interests and what I feel like in general people should know going into this is that really people need to know this going into the set of interviews. If you were given a handful of interviews about these events without any context to it, either within the city of Buffalo or across the country, you don't have all the information. So just as a good archivist, it's important to give that background. And I feel like, you know, that the ethics of our profession dictate that I take my time and do my research and make sure I'm using, you know, language about a community that comes from the community and accurate information, and also the benefit of hindsight. You know, the way we look at events now, which maybe wouldn't have been the way people talked about it then, why it was called a riot and why, you know, we generally wouldn't use that now. The people who were participating in these events certainly wouldn't consider a riot in terms of what that connotes, which is sort of, you know, senseless violence. This came out for a reason. So that's just an example of how we can put that kind of thing into practice. I thought it was important to give you a concrete example of how at least I put that kind of thing into practice and things that we can keep in mind as we're creating documentation.